Italian delegation for its welcome in this historic chamber. My name is Jean-Marie Fievet. I'm from the French National Assembly, and I'm Vice Chair of the GSM. We will start this afternoon with the first afternoon panel, looking into the geopolitical developments taking place in Iran and in the Gulf. We have two researchers from the European Council for International Relations, ECFR, and they will talk to us about the increasing role of the Gulf in the international system and their impact on diplomatic relations. We're going to listen to Cinzia Bleibianco first, who will be talking about how Gulf relations with the Euro-Atlantic community are developing. She is part of the ECFR. She works on political security and economic developments in the peninsula and in the Gulf. Now, Cinzia needs to leave at 4:15, and so I'll give her the floor immediately. Many thanks, and you have the floor.
Yeah, merci beaucoup. And thank you, everyone. Thank you for the invitation. It's an honor to be here. I will try to make it slightly shorter than it was supposed to be in the program so that we can make up for some of the time and also have, hopefully, a very rich discussion. So I will sort of provide by headlines, and I'm happy to go into more details in the Q&A. The topic that we are addressing today, the evolution of the geopolitical positioning of the Gulf monarchies, is an incredibly dynamic topic. I always say that I've started studying these countries 12 years ago, and I keep finding myself surprised of how quick things changed and how much things have changed compared to 12 years ago. One of the things that has changed the most is the Gulf monarchies' relations with the United States. And so let me also be slightly provocative and controversial when I say that I think we are observing one of the most sensitive and critical phases in the relations between the 6 GCC monarchies and the United States. Of course, the United States remains the most significant security partner for Saudi Arabia, for the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Kuwait, Bahrain, and Oman. But at the same time, there's been, over the past few years, so this is not entirely new, a progressive eroding of the trust between these actors and the United States. And so with diminishing confidence in the United States as a security guarantor, and given how fundamental this trust and this security relationship was for the Gulf countries, we are seeing a number of repercussions on all other aspects of the international life of these countries. And that includes implications on these countries' relations with Europe. Both the European Union, this is a very new relations, and also older, decades-old relations between these countries and the likes of France, the United Kingdom, and other European countries and players. So because the two partners, the two sides, the United States and the Europeans, had developed their relations to this part of the world in sync, in very close alignment, and in close coordination, then any significant change on one end of the side of the coin has significant implications on the other as well. And we have seen that this is not one-sided only. There's been a number of dynamic changes that has brought the countries to relate to one another and to regional and global issues in very different ways. So we are speaking within a NATO context. So let me straight away address the elephant in the room. A lot of NATO countries, a lot of countries in Europe, and definitely in Washington, were very surprised by the positioning of a number of Gulf monarchies vis-à-vis Russia after the invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. That it was a given from a Western point of view that our regional partners would align to our perception of the events and would see that a territorial invasion and a violation of sovereignty and territorial integrity was taking place so flagrantly that you couldn't really see it otherwise. In fact, what happened was that from the regional point of view, those events were taken into a much wider context. And that includes other controversial military operations within and without the region, where the regional countries had their reservations and their critics to the Western players, which were not always welcomed and listened to. So that disparity has created the basis for a different thinking, a thinking that instead of prioritizing alignment and cooperation and strategic partnership, in many cases has prioritized national interest. And so from a national interest point of view, it wasn't a given that regional countries would look at the invasion of Ukraine as we have looked at the invasion of Ukraine. And that is what explains a number of choices, of policy choices that we are grappling with today. But does that mean that this relationship is now beyond repair or is too far gone? Absolutely not. We, I think, are seeing an evolution of the relationship from all point of views, both a political point of view, but also a geo-economic point of view and a security point of view. And I want to now introduce a NATO-specific point, which is that I think we are seeing in how NATO is looking at the Gulf and at the Gulf monarchies. As all of you know, a number of Gulf monarchies are already NATO partners through the ICI. But we have seen now new initiatives and new efforts including, due to new personnel that has been active at the highest level of the Secretariat, to engage with the Gulf monarchies, to turn a page, to see if NATO can rethink its role and its presence in the region in a way that makes a lot of sense for the regional actors. Because at the end of the day, the regional actors, despite all of the changes that we have seen, and we have seen many changes, they still have, I would argue, very similar security needs that they have had over the past decade. So we are seeing, for example, let me maybe highlight the clearest example. We have seen a reversal to some extent of the political relationship between Saudi Arabia and Iran, from an approach that has been confrontation only to an approach that is now confrontation and engagement, and that tries to also use diplomatic tools to keep tensions within control. But at the same time, we also are seeing that the tensions related to the Gaza war are having an impact over this detent attempt, this effort to try and keep the tensions under control. And we know that there's concerns and there are incidents in the Red Sea, in the border between Yemen and Saudi Arabia, in the northern border that Saudi Arabia shares with Jordan and Iraq, where Saudi is involved, whether indirectly, into the escalation, that is the much wider escalation that is taking place in a gradual manner between Iran on one side and Israel and NATO on the other side. And that means that ultimately Saudi Arabia will still need to restore and update and renew and strengthen deterrence in a very specific way. So we have seen, for example, that the latest discussion between a NATO high-level delegation and in Saudi Arabia have highlighted things like protecting critical infrastructure, protecting lines of connectivity, with Riyadh being incredibly active on geoeconomics and connectivity, cybersecurity, how delicate and fragile can the cyber and digital and space infrastructures be, and how crucial are they at the same time to keep the country running, to achieve objectives. And that is not only the case for Saudi Arabia. The United Arab Emirates, Qatar, all of the GCC monarchies are very ambitious, and they continue to live in a very dangerous environment. So Oman, look at Oman, for example, is obviously its own security and existence is obviously tied to maritime security in its territorial waters. And that comes with a particular attention to smuggling, as well as to piracy, as well as to also all sorts of non-state actors' activities, both in the Arabian Gulf, but I would argue throughout the Red Sea. So my point is, and I will conclude here, that perhaps this is a good environment to try and be creative and think about the new ways in which we can reboot some of the dynamics in the security cooperation between particularly NATO and the regional countries. Thank you.
Many thanks, Cinzia, for what you've said. It was fascinating. I'm going to give the floor maybe for questions or directly to the second speaker. Okay, set questions and answers so Cynthia can leave us on time. No, carry on. So there are no questions, and so we'll have the second speaker, and then we'll group together all the questions. So the floor is now to Camille Lons, who is also in the same institute in Paris. She works on geoeconomics and the relations between China and the Gulf. She was also research associate in the Strategic Institute in Bahrain and Taiwan. Camille, you have the floor.
Merci beaucoup.
Many thanks.
Thank you for having me today. It's a pleasure to listen to the conversations. My presentation is actually going to flow very well from the very important points that Cinzia has made. I was asked to speak about China's emerging role in the MENA region, a bit more specifically in the Gulf as well. So China is a player that has emerged quite significantly in this region and relatively recently, over the past decade or so. Initially more as an economic power, it is the biggest energy client of this region. Also in the context of the Belt and Road Initiative, it has increased quite significantly its interactions, economic interactions with the region. But more interestingly, what we see recently is also the fact that China is becoming an actor that is not just economic anymore, and that is also potentially playing a political role in this region. And in this sense, the past couple of years have been quite eventful, especially in the Gulf context. We have seen China playing a kind of mediation or at least facilitation role in the Saudi-Iran rapprochement. We saw also a number of countries from the regions, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Egypt, a few others also from the GCC, joining some multilateral organizations such as the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and the BRICS, as well as Some of them are not confirmed yet. Saudi Arabia has not confirmed yet, but joining these organizations that are where China is playing a significant role, and whose objective is also to challenge the kind of Western-led international order and provide an alternative for global governance. We see also a growing cooperation of China with certain states, especially in the GCC, in key strategic sectors, not just in the energy sector, but like in AI, in new technologies, in renewable energies. We see also emerging discussions about the possibility of oil being traded in China's currency, in renminbi. And so all these recent developments are kind of questioning raising new questions about the role that China is playing in this region and the nature of the relationship that it is having with the region. I would argue that these emerging relationships can have the potential to be a game changer for the region's geopolitics. It's less about what China does effectively in the region, because in reality, if we look at what it has been doing and delivering in the region, it remains quite limited when it comes to investment, or even more on the security kind of involvement. This involvement is quite limited, and the importance of the region to China is sometimes exaggerated a little bit. It's not as important as what we could think. So it's less about what China does in the region, but this whole discussion about China's role is more interesting because it translates a broader shift in the regional order, in the way, and this is what Cinzia was mentioning, the way regional powers are relating with big external powers like the US. And this is, I think this broader discussion about China is the reflection of this bigger change that is happening and that can be highly consequential. So maybe to give to enter a bit more into the details. I speak here about the MENA region as a bloc, but actually you have high differences between different countries in the region, of course. The interests of China are very different when you talk about some of the big oil exporting countries like Saudi Arabia, or some countries like Egypt, for example, that are positioned on important maritime trade routes, or a country like Israel that has interesting technologies that can be interesting for China in the context of the US-China tech war. This is, of course, very different from the type of engagement that China has with smaller or other Middle Eastern countries where the economic situation is less interesting for China. And so when you look at the picture for the entire region, it's been 10 years since the launch of the Belt and Road Initiative. The Chinese investments, for example, in the region are relatively limited and sometimes have been a little bit disappointing. Some of the projects that had been promised at the beginning, at the launch of this initiative, have not always led to the type of investment that we're expecting initially. You also have a recalibration of China's foreign policy objectives, where the Belt and Road Initiative is becoming less important. And there's a shift away from big infrastructure projects towards digital infrastructures, towards a more diplomatic offensive to push alternative models of governance. So we see also a shift of priorities in China's approach to the region. And so we see a widening gap between some key Middle Eastern countries that are more interesting and more important to China, and I'm thinking here about some key GCC powers, especially Saudi Arabia, the UAE, where we see an uptick recently in the engagement, and some Middle Eastern and the rest of the region where there is we're reaching a plateau in terms of the development of the relations that we see between China and that region. I'm not going to develop too much the relations between China and these key Gulf states, but we see really an interesting development in recent years. why this is important, especially in the relationship between China, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, when it comes to new technologies, when it comes to even the defense and security sectors. This has raised concerns, especially in the US, that it could create some vulnerabilities with risk of transfers of technologies, with risk of espionage or control over preferential access to critical national infrastructures like ports. I think, again, as I was saying in the introduction, I think this is less about what China is really doing in the region at the moment than about how this is reflecting broader shifts in the priorities of these countries and in their relations with big powers. And I think this is what we should be focusing on at the moment, because in practice, I think there are also some limits. We can go into that in the conversation, but significant limits to that relationship between China and even some of the key Middle Eastern powers. What we see with recent developments, especially in Gaza, is that these countries still look at the US as the key security provider, the one that is able to protect and advance hard power and protect a state like the State of Israel. And we see that these countries are still pushing for greater security guarantees from the US because they know that China is not going to provide them these kind of guarantees that they're looking for. And even on the economic front, when we look, for example, at emerging technologies, when these countries are forced to choose, they still continue to choose some of the key Western technologies because they consider them still as more innovative. It's more prestigious to work with Microsoft still today. And so they're trying to balance these relations and not being forced to take side between China and some of the Western partners, but when they're forced at the moment, they still continue to go for their partnership with the US. And so what does that mean exactly for NATO countries? It's about, I think the most important thing is to take very seriously these changes that we see and what they mean exactly in terms of the ability of NATO countries, and this is what Cinzia was saying, the ability to create coalitions with these partners in the region and to shape a little bit some of the developments happening in the direct neighborhood. But it's important also to impose clear red lines on certain key strategic issues. But it's also important to not be fooled too quickly by the discourses of rising China and declining West, because we see that in many areas, this relationship between big Western powers, especially the US, and the Gulf will have a lot to continue on. So I stop here, but looking forward to the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Cinzia, and thank you, Camille, for your intervention. It was really fascinating. I would have a question for you straight away. I'm not sure who would want to answer, but on fossil fuel, China, of course, is an emerging power. A lot of changes, more than 1 billion inhabitants. And there's a lot of demand for fossil fuels there at the moment. So for us as Europeans and member of NATO, how could that have an impact on us? There's this increasing demand for fuel, for energy in China. So what impact would that have on us? And what do they think in China of renewables? Of course, Europe is really committed to renewables. Same for NATO member states. And what does China think about that? Thank you.
Alors, on va prendre également.
We'll take some more questions. Our Turkish colleague wanted to take the floor. Where is he? Utku, there you are. You have the floor, dear colleague.
Thank you for the presentations indeed. My question to the panel would be, how do you see the role of bigger players in the region, such as Saudi Arabia, balancing between global powers such as US and China, and how sustainable is that hedging strategy, and how sustainable would this hedging strategy would be? Thank you.
Thank you for your questions. I'll take the last one, and Camille will take the first one. So I am one of those people, I mean, and of course, if you want to comment on that as well, because we have looked at this balancing question from the two perspectives. But I am one of those people who believes that in the longer term, this kind of balancing is not sustainable. I think that so far the contours of great powers' rivalry are not as defined yet, but I see a deterioration of that situation on several fronts. I'm still quite concerned about Taiwan. I'm not an optimist on what might happen in Taiwan. And so I do not think that in the longer term, this extreme hedging is going to be sustainable. But that longer term, I cannot say when it will come. So in the meantime, in this transition, I think we will continue to see a lot of hedging and balancing. And then at some point it will become unsustainable. But I think we need to concern ourselves with what happens in this transition until we reach that point.
Thank you. Maybe to complete a little bit also on the point that Cinzia was made, I completely agree with her on the fact that there is a risky bet that the Gulf states are making here in trying to push as far as possible where they can go on the relationship with China. And the risk of, at some point, crossing a red line that is going to erode significantly the possibility to continue the relationship, especially on key security sectors with the US. And we've already seen that happening a little bit, and they actually retropedalate after that. It was the UAE on the F-35 deal a few years ago when they were negotiating a deal for the acquisition of F-35 with the US. And this deal collapsed partially also because of concerns of the US over the UAE's relationship with China. There was rumors of a potential Chinese base. There were a growing cooperation also between the UAE and China on the tech infrastructure. And so this is typically an area where there is sometimes a risk where you cross a red line and you cannot go back, and that can have long-term implications on the level of security cooperation that you can have with a partner like the US. And this is the point that the US has made quite clear to their Gulf partners, and where they have pressed the UAE first to backpedal on their advanced tech cooperation with China. We've seen that with a company called G42, which is the leading AI company in the UAE that had to backpedal on some of the deals it was doing with China. We see also the US using again that card in the negotiations happening right now with Saudi Arabia in the kind of broader normalization for a security deal. But until now, the Gulf states, I think, also are trying to take advantage a little bit of this kind of broader fragmentation and rivalry between the US and China. Their bet is that they can be, and I think there's a very good paper by Cinzia on this topic, on like they can position themselves as interconnectors in a world that is more fragmented, where the Europeans are de-risking some of their supply chains vis-a-vis China. The Gulf states try to see how they can take advantage of the current situation. But yeah, I agree that this is probably not very sustainable in the long term. On energy, so I don't know if the question was about whether the growing demand of energy from China is going to be pose an energy security issue for other partners. That's a good question. I think at the moment this is not the way it is being framed in some of the conversation that I've seen, in the sense where there's been a change, a broader change in terms of the global energy landscape, where, you know, with the global energy transitions, the shale revolution in the US have put away the risk of this fear that we would be fighting over energy resources. But at the same time, what we see with the war in Ukraine is that energy and access to energy continues to be highly geopolitical. And so this is definitely something where I think we need to still pay a lot of attention, especially when it comes to a potential crisis in the Indo-Pacific. The Indo-Pacific is the biggest importer and is completely dependent on oil and gas coming from the Gulf. And so in case of an escalation happening in the Indo-Pacific, the Gulf states are going to be indirect players in this landscape, depending on how they decide to play and where they decide to side or not. Of course, they will try for as long as possible not to side and not to politicize access to energy. But if something go very bad in the Indo-Pacific, it's difficult. It will be increasingly difficult for them to keep that balance. And so I agree that energy could become again an element of competition. And given that China now is the biggest client and will remain so in the decades to come, this is an existential issue for Gulf states having access to that market.
Merci.
Thank you, Cinzia, and thank you, Camille, once again. 4 more questions. 2 questions from Harriet from the United Kingdom. Please go ahead.
Monsieur Fievé. My question is about Russian sanctions, and NATO countries have obviously gone to great lengths to sanction Russia in various different ways to try and prevent a build-up of the economy in order to finance the illegal invasion of Ukraine. I just wondered to what extent the Gulf countries are helping to support that process of sanctioning Russia, or to what extent Gulf countries are benefiting from helping Russia get around those sanctions.
Et ensuite, le collègue.
And now, Theo, you wanted to take the floor. Go ahead.
Oui, merci, Monsieur le Président. Thank you very much. I have one question. One of the biggest issues that you hear from also African countries and you read in analysis is that Russia and China, they don't bother about human rights. They don't issue it. And Europe and the West are always playing moral high ground and always giving lessons. And a lot of African regimes and African governments, they don't want to hear about it. The same for Middle East. It is always a very difficult role we have to play between being like realpolitik, where we have to say we don't bother, actually not really either, because we had Arab Spring, it was a total failure. We're dealing with Northern Africa. When we see the reports of NGOs on human rights, it's not number 1 on the list when you talk about those and with those countries. But then again, Russia and China are not doing that, or are they? I don't know. I think that they aren't. So what lessons learned from us? What do we have to do? Because in our parliaments, people are asking about, oh, you've been to country X or Y. Did you mention that guy in prison? Did you mention that woman or that politician who is for 6 months in jail without a trial? Did you do that? Did you do that? And then I'm saying, no, I didn't, because I was not there to give them lessons. I was there to talk about migration, to talk about trade, to talk about business, to talk about security cooperation. I was not there to give them a lecture about their judicial system. And then the NGOs, but also some parliamentarians more of the left, they say, that's wrong. you're going in beds with horrible people. So you're like complementary of being like slaughtering and massacrating. I don't know. You know what I mean. So what do we have to do? What is your advice? Thank you very much.
So very interesting questions. On the Russian sanctions, we have seen two phases. In phase one, we have seen undoubtedly not all the Gulf countries, but some Gulf countries actively supporting Russia to evade sanctions. Let's clear something up right away. The GCC, none of the GCC countries have officially adopted the sanctions, so they are not obviously breaking any law in any sense, right? Because they have not made it their own. And so they have, therefore, the sovereignty to reject those sanctions if their national interest tells them so. And that's exactly what happened. I mean, it's not a coincidence that we have seen an unprecedented influx of Russian capital, citizens, and then firms into Dubai and the United Arab Emirates at large. The United Arab Emirates has been a number of, I think it's over 30 firms now, small size and micro size firms, most often operating out of free zones. There's more than 30 free zones in the country that have been placed on the sanctions list by the US Treasury, which is in some cases implementing secondary sanctions when there is a very specific case that is relevant. So this is not a secret anymore. It is of public dominion that in the UAE there has been a conscious choice, especially in the beginning, to facilitate Russia to evade sanctions. It's also been proven that both the UAE and Saudi Arabia have received a shipment of Russian crude, that there is an uptick in the crude that they have bought for themselves, for their consumption locally, but there's been also investigations that have proven that some of these shipments have been rebranded and re-exported as local oil. So, and that has been the same for Saudi Arabia. Then, you know, we have seen, for example, a booming of the crypto markets, both specifically in the UAE, but also in the wider region. And why was that? It is because, of course, it is the least transparent way of moving capital. But then we have seen a shift over the past, I would say, couple of months, and I think there has been a political effort coordinated, I would argue, at the G7 level even, because I think, you know, the Japanese have contributed to that directly in their conversation with Saudis and Emiratis, but also the US and the European Union to sort of have a different arrangement and understanding and conversations with the regional partners, and we have seen a slight change. And for example, the UAE is, I would argue, taking it more seriously to at least stop the re-export of some electronics components that is proven that they have been used to for military purposes. So these things, I mean, I think there is some margin now to push ahead. And then very quickly on human rights, 30 seconds. I think that we are never going to be able to act like Russia and China. This is out of the question. I don't see any world in which the Europeans can simply ignore the human rights issues completely because of what you just said. We actually have to respond to the people. And this is important for the people. So I've been arguing that it's about the way that we talk about these issues. You know, for example, women's rights. It is a golden moment to be pushing ahead for women's rights in Saudi Arabia and the UAE. and in a way that is not about lecturing, but is actually about making progress together because of all the progress that has been happening, and it should be recognized and it should be acknowledged as happening. And we can do that also with our electorate, and then push ahead together because there is margin. Another thing is religious freedom. Same thing in Saudi Arabia. There is a lot of space to push ahead in a way that is not insulting or lecturing.
Maybe quick points on sanctions. I think a space to watch. This is definitely a space to watch in the future, and this is going to affect. We're talking right now about Russia, but this is going to affect probably also the relationship with China in a context of growing rivalries between the U.S. and China, including in the economic sphere. And something that we see rising a lot in the Gulf at the moment is this debate around de-dollarization. That again, we shouldn't hype too much for a lot of reasons, but it says a lot about how the Gulf states are trying to reduce their vulnerability to potential economic coercion, including from the US, and shield themselves against potential sanctions. And so developing alternative financial pipelines to be able to circumvent sanctions when necessary. And this is something that we should be watching very closely, I think. Second point on human rights, very much agree with Cinzia. I think that the narrative that has been that we've heard a lot recently on dividing the world between autocracies and democracies has not helped at all. I think these kind of big narratives and lecturing positions is not something that is helping, Western countries pushing for values. It's also important to be more consistent with the values that we defend to avoid this accusation of dual standards that we have been confronted to quite a lot recently. But I also agree that it's important to be strong on our basis and not give up on them too easily because we are confronted to competition by other big powers like China or Russia. And I think that for European powers or Western powers, this values-based approach is key, is core, and we shouldn't give up on it too easily either.
Merci à vous deux. Il me reste encore 4 questions.
Thank you very much. There are 4 more questions. I'll ask you to keep your questions brief and the answers brief. The first question is from Fernando, Spain.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Chair.
Quick question. I wonder which is the relationship between both countries in the region. Do they appear as allies? Do they appear as competitors? Do they have hide agendas for the other, or do they share agendas in front of the countries of the Gulf? Thank you.
Deuxième question posée par
Second question, Mikko from Finland.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. My question is about the Chinese presence through the investments. So what is the relationship between China and the Gulf countries? How much China has invested and how much they are planning to invest in this area, in these countries? And how do you see what should be done to reduce the China addiction in this area? Thank you.
On va poser les 2 autres questions à suivre.
2 more questions. Mr. Boaz from Israel.
Thank you very much for the presentation. Merci, Monsieur le Président. The topic today is about geopolitics in Iran and the Gulf. And we spoke a lot about the Gulf, less about Iran. And I think it's a factor. I think it's an important factor. And I think that in the morning session, you mentioned yourself, I mean, all the people who spoke about the presentation spoke about Iran as destabilizing the region. Now, you, Madam, spoke about incidents in the Red Sea, incidents. But it's not just incidents. It's something serious that started on the 19th of October, as much as I remember, something that is putting in danger international trade, threatening lives. You know, it's missiles. You call it war. You call it war. You don't call it incidents. And why do I say that? Because our friends in the Gulf those with whom we have relations or those we do not, yet we respect. Look for stability. This is the key thing. Why are we sitting here, all of us here? Because we seek for stability. Now, there is a country that destabilized the region, and it is very cunning because it has proxies, and it makes war outside its region until the 13th, 14th of April, where they try to struck us directly. Why do I say that? Because I'm wondering, and I'm asking you the question, soft reactions like we had, and I'll give you examples, specific ones. 2018, Iran launching a missile over Saudi Arabia, reaction, very soft, no reaction, I would say, even from our friends in America. A year after, later, on the 14th of September, I think, Houthi, those who you mentioned incidents, I mean, fire again, installations, all installations in Saudi Arabia, no reaction whatsoever. A country like mine, which is Israel, being threatened by Houthis again, I mean, where boats cannot pass, vessels cannot pass, no reaction whatsoever. So my question is, how long, I mean, how much can we be surprised by the fact that Gulf countries like Saudi Arabia will go towards Iran, engage, as you said yourself, via China, because when you do not react and you look for stability, so you go somewhere else. And maybe last comment I would like to tell you. We live in an era, and you said so perfectly well, and I agree with you totally when you mentioned Taiwan. And you said, I'm very much afraid about what's going to happen in Taiwan. There was this amazing book written by Stefan Zweig, The World of Yesterday. I think he who didn't read it should read it today. I'm not saying, God forbid, 2 world wars are threatening us, but the world is changing right now. And every country, every continent, every nation is trying to position itself. Now, in this changing world that you know perfectly well, better than I, there's no vacuum. Either we keep our values, like you said it beautifully, or we shall have Chinese vessels 10 years, 20 years, 30 years in front of Taiwan, and then we can write Stefan Zweig, The World of Yesterday, in bis. Thank you very much.
Très bien, merci. Dernière question, Anna.
Last question, Anna.
Very much. I'd like to go back to Russia and broaden the discussion a little bit beyond Gulf reactions to the sanctions. As you mentioned correctly during your presentation, the Gulf very much cares about its access to energy markets, right? In addition to that, if you look at the Gulf reaction to the war in Ukraine, there's also a deeper issue in terms of how differently the region perceives Western reaction to Ukraine versus coming to the aid of their partners in the Gulf. So there's a perception of the West as hypocritical. The views, in other words, the way this region views Ukraine, the war itself, and the West, the narratives on the war are very, very different. So how do you see, I guess 2 questions. Do you see these countries crossing a red line, specifically when it comes to Russia, when you discuss this hedging? Is there a red line, and what would that look like? And 2, can we bridge the gap in these narratives and our different perceptions on the war in Ukraine? Thank you.
So very quick. Saudi Arabia and the UAE, I think we need to watch that dynamic very carefully, because it is a partnership, but we are seeing elements of strategic competition. And if they are not managed, they are managed and under control so far, but they could get out of hand. And we have seen already in the region something like that happening with Qatar. Chinese investment, I think Camille is going to talk about it. I will just say that the European Union and China are always first and second in terms of both investment and trade with the GCC. So basically we just swap places every year. And I think last year it was the European Union. The Red Sea, I call them, so first of all, sir, you're going to have a full panel on Iran, so don't worry about that. That's why we didn't talk about it, because we wanted to be efficient. The first Houthi operation against the tanker is actually from 2018, so this is not the 19th of October. And I agree that, there's been softer reactions have definitely been interpreted in the way that you described it regionally. And I also think that these scenarios are all linked. The ones that we are seeing, Ukraine, in Gaza, what happened, the tragedy that happened to your country on the 7th of October, and what may happen quite soon in the Indo-Pacific, are, in my view, all linked together. And this is why I'm very concerned. I don't think that we've given red lines to Russia. I think we have given gray lines on Russia. to the Gulf. And that's why we are seeing already some wavering.
On investment, so I don't want to minimize the importance of Chinese investments. There is a growing trend. They are interested in investing in the Gulf, especially when it comes to the energy question. You know, the investment going on both ways are a way to kind of create, and they invest all along the kind of value chain of energy to petrochemicals and refineries. And this is a way to really strengthen a long-term relationship in energy and access, maintain long-term access to energy resources. But overall, these investments coming from China, when you look at the big picture, it's quite disappointing compared to what we could expect. In stocks, so I think Cinzia was speaking about flows. When you look at stocks, so for example, for a country like Saudi Arabia, it's about $5 billion in stocks. That's half what Saudi Arabia receives from the US, and that's a quarter of what it receives from the EU. So it's quite minimal compared to the size of the Chinese economy and compared to what could be expected. And on the red line, I think one thing also to think about the red lines for Russia, I think there you have a similar dynamic in terms of like how the Gulf states try to balance relations with different big powers as a way to gain leverage when they interact also with their partners, including the US. But I think that the challenge is not the same at all when it comes to Russia and when it comes to China. I think that China is going to pose a more structural challenge to the relationship with the relationship with the West, the long-term kind of balance of powers than Russia is because of the kind of geo-economic weight of China and how it is evolving in the future. Yeah.
Très bien. Je vous remercie.
Thank you very much for your presentations and for your answers. Thank you for enlightening us with your knowledge on the area. Thank you very much.
On va donc passer maintenant.
Ladies and gentlemen, I will now close this discussion. So thank you to the two speakers. And before we move on to the next panel on Iran's evolving challenges to regional stability, which would be moderated by our Turkish colleague Utku Çakırozer, I would like to give the floor to Giovanni Romani, head of the MENA section at NATO, who will provide the closing remarks. Giovanni, you have the floor. Thank you very much, the chair.
Lorenzo Cesa per questo invito e per aver organizzato questo eccezionale evento. I will express myself in English, and I will start by answering a question which I'm asked very often, which is how busy are you with NATO so focused on Ukraine? And actually, I would say more than ever, because the last year has been a year of reflection process on the South, because actually the ongoing crisis, the attack of Russia against Ukraine, also the crisis we have now in Gaza, they all have, one is of course in the region, and others have a spillover effect, for example, in the case of the Ukrainian crisis, we have a huge problem of food security, which has repercussion on a number of countries in MENA. One example is Egypt. But I also want to mention how, and I'm happy that there are a number of people here, members of parliament that represent countries in MENA. We are, of course, horrified by what is happening in Ukraine. We're very concerned about the situation in Gaza. But actually, when I talk to my colleagues in Middle East and North Africa, it is a daily thing. I mean, we're talking about an arch of instability and crisis, which has been going on for decades, and unfortunately is kind of the daily reality of a number of these countries. And if you look back, actually, the worst humanitarian crisis a couple of years ago was Yemen. Now it's probably Sudan. And we don't talk about this crisis. Look at Syria. Look what we had in Libya. So we don't talk about this crisis on a daily basis. A lot of attention is actually on the other two that I mentioned before. On the geostrategic competition, which actually this panel is about also, as we mentioned, China, Russia, Iran, for sure. Certainly, it's an area of geostrategic competition. Let me offer some considerations. First of all, and here we're talking about the Gulf, for example. When there's a gap or a perceived gap, it's going to be filled. So if there's a perceived gap of, for example, like a security provider, and you understand what I'm talking about, and the security provider is no longer perceived as engaged as it used to be, then someone else is going to fill that gap. The second consideration, I don't want to talk about autocracies versus democracies, but let me actually focus on another aspect, which is longevity. So when we talk about the monarchies in the Gulf, for example, the 6 of the GCC, we talk about ruling families that have a long-term perspective. And this is an area of the world in which personal relations are key, building trust, confidence is key, and actually the disadvantage that we have as NATO, as Western countries, is that we have actually elections, and our leaders change. That is not the case, for example, for Xi or for Putin, that are seen as leaders that have certain longevity. So whatever is kind of agreed with them is something that will stay, will stick. And this is a disadvantage that certainly we have in our engagement. So when we talk about NATO, and when we engage, of course, on the east flank, and you know that NATO has 3 core tasks. The first is collective defense, which is about deterrence and defense. The second one is crisis management and prevention, actually. The third one is cooperative security. So when we look at the East, of course, our approach is mostly through deterrence and defense. But when we look at the South, our approach has to be actually cooperative security and crisis prevention, which actually implies an engagement with our partners, implies teaming up, implies doing things together. Particularly when we talk about the Gulf, we don't start from scratch, because actually we have we build on 20 years of the Istanbul Cooperation Initiative, which has provided an important platform for dialogue and trust building. Just wanted to remind you that our partners have contributed to NATO-led operations and missions, taking part in interoperability exercise. We have established a NATO center in Kuwait. It's the NATO ICI Regional Center. And actually, it's our only presence in Middle East and North Africa. We're now in the process of establishing a political office in Amman, but that will be our second. So to tell you that also when we talk about the level of ambition of NATO, we have also to take into account that we are just not there. And again, presence and personal engagements are key in engaging with these countries. So we hope that this reflection process will also lead to raising the bar of the NATO level of ambition. So I want to also to address what our Israeli colleague was talking about, and that is Iran. So on Iran, actually, we share a concern. It is true that the countries in the Gulf are at least the 6 we deal with. I would say the 4 ICI plus Saudi Arabia and Oman. And actually, the Secretary General was in Saudi Arabia in December. It's the first time ever of a Secretary General in 75 years of NATO. So that gives also a sign of our engagement in trying to strengthen our relationship also with countries which are not partners, but that we see as important in the region. And these 6 countries are actually stable, prosperous, and what they want is stability in the region. So, and that's something which, of course, exactly matches with the interests of NATO. And NATO wants stability. That is what we would like to see in our neighborhood. Now, when we talk about Iran, of course, it's a matter of containing and deterring, and the international concerns of Iran are essentially in 4 areas. One is the threat of then going nuclear, of course. The second one is the ballistic missile threat, which is current and present, of course. The third one is the proxies. They've been mentioned. I will not get into details again. And the fourth one is their increasing collaboration with Moscow, which, of course, from a NATO perspective, it is a big concern. And this is actually leading, these and other factors, because, of course, there's a huge level of complexity in the region, to like a multilateral approach, including by Israel, with the Abraham Accords, and we heard Ambassador Massolo this morning mentioning that, started looking into like a security architecture that goes beyond like defending Israel by itself without support from the others. And actually, if you observe like the attack, unprecedented, the first time that there's a direct attack of Iran against Israel, the threat was also addressed by support from allies. Some are Western, but some are actually allies from the Gulf. So we see already how Gulf countries, for the sake of maintaining a certain stability and addressing together some threats, have already reached a certain level of multilateralism in the security architecture, which I would like to underline because it is also unprecedented. So going back to NATO. So NATO in this reflection process has to kind of move in the direction of being an even more relevant actor. But I want to stress that NATO is not a Swiss knife in which we can use various tools. We cannot do everything. We are not on the front line on every single thing. And so we need to focus on things on which we can add value and actually areas in which we are welcome. We're talking about a complex region in which not always the NATO intervention will be seen as helpful and productive. So we have to take this into account. And again, I go back to our relationship with the countries in the region with which we need a continuous political dialogue and increase our understanding. In going back to multilateralism, one interlocutor which for us is of growing importance is the Gulf Cooperation Council. So the Gulf Cooperation Council has just launched a vision on regional security, and this is a testimony of a multilateral approach for a security architecture that we would like to see in the future. They're already teaming up with the European Union. We are also in close contact with them, and would like to see this collaboration between the two international organizations growing more and more. And then we have a number of themes, and some of them were mentioned by Cinzia, which we already are addressing together with these countries. Let me mention counterterrorism, hybrid threats, maritime security, very important to them, protection of critical infrastructure, and of course we're talking about countries that have important energy infrastructure, both maritime, underwater, and land infrastructure. And also climate change. And from a NATO perspective, we would, of course, address the security implications of climate change. One last point I would like to mention is the battle of narratives. So it is a very difficult terrain for us, and it was mentioned that there is certainly a very aggressive campaign from our peer competitors that highlight issues such as the colonial past of the West taking sides in the conflicts that we mentioned, or applying double standards. So we need to communicate better, we need to communicate more, and we need to stick to our values and to explain our actions. And that is where I would like to underline the importance of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly and your role in supporting NATO in carrying these values and this message forward, engaging with partners as you're doing in events like this. So I would like to close by thanking you for all you do. Wish the NATO Parliamentary Assembly a great success, because your success is the success of NATO, and that is much appreciated. Thank you.
Merci aux intervenants. Merci.
Many thanks, Giovanni. Many thanks, Cynthia. I know you're in a hurry, but many thanks for having made the time. And Camille, and see you soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Colleagues, we have had great discussions today, and before beginning this second panel on Iran, I would first like to thank our Italian hosts, Mr. Lorenzo Cesa, and Italian colleagues and Italian delegation for this warm welcome and wonderful program in this beautiful city, Rome. Thank you indeed. And now I will begin the second panel of session 2 with a focus on Iran's evolving challenges to regional and Euro-Atlantic security. I'll first give the floor to Ms. Anna Borshevskaya, a recognized expert on Russia's activities across the Middle East, who will brief us on Russo-Iranian strategic and economic cooperation and on these challenges such cooperation poses to regional and Euro-Atlantic security. Ms. Borshevskaya joins us in Rome from Washington, D.C., where she is a senior fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. She is also the author of the 2021 book, Putin's War in Syria, Russian Foreign Policy, and the Price of America's Absence. Anna, thank you very much for being here, and you have the floor, please.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you today. I'd like to start by framing the Russia-Iran relationship from a global perspective. Russia is at war with the West. It is at war to remake the world order. As I reflect on my first time speaking here in this venue in 2016, after Russia's intervention in Syria, I remember that making this point that Russia is at war with the West appeared a bit too controversial. But now we see that this is not a controversial point at all. After Russia's invasion of Ukraine, I'm really pushing on an open door at this point by making this assertion, but I'd like to start with this big picture perspective. And when we look at the Russia-Iran relationship, we need to look at it within this context of Russia's bigger aim to challenge the liberal post-World War II global order. It is within this context that Russia is aligning with the so-called Global South, and Iran is an integral part of these efforts. So within this context, it's very important to look at the connections between Russia's war in Ukraine and Russia's relationship with Iran. So within this context, Russia and Iran are accelerating their efforts towards what I would call a strategic partnership. In my view, this relationship was always strategic, but the war in Ukraine has accelerated these efforts. We're now seeing Russia also for the first time being reliant on Iran, and that is one historic shift within the really 500 years of Russia-Iran relations. Russia has never found itself reliant on Iran before. It's an important change for us to pay attention to. But this strategic shift in terms of accelerated relations between Russia and Iran is visible beyond the military realm alone. We see Iran being integrated more into regional institutions where Russia is an important member, such as the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Iran launched a domestically launched image satellite from Kazakhstan last August. So it's evidence of scientific cooperation between the two countries, and certainly raises questions about potential surveillance capabilities that Iran could use, and also how it can be used in the war in Ukraine. More broadly, these two countries agree on the bigger strategic picture. And that strategic picture, specifically in the Middle East, has to do with limiting American and more broadly Western influence. The fact of the matter is Russia always insisted that that American presence in Syria, for example, is illegal, but Iranian presence is not. So Russia is looking for ways to challenge, to push back on American and more broadly European Western influence. And it is not merely acting as a spoiler, it is actively using whatever crises on the ground to make the situation worse. One example of that is last summer's continual harassment of American drones in Syria, and more recently harassment of American and Israeli troops in the region. Russia is using its influence within Iranian proxies to accelerate chaos, to exacerbate chaos in the Middle East. So it's not a mere bystander, it is actually making chaos in the region worse. And of course, there's lots of other evidence of strategic cooperation between these countries. Let me just mention briefly joint Russian and Iranian efforts to look for alternative trade routes, the so-called north-south and east-west corridor that goes through the South Caucasus. This particular region is a very much understudied but important arena of Russia-Iran cooperation, and something that we need to watch more closely in the future. So let me again wrap this up. I'm happy to answer more questions about the Russia-Iran relationship in more detail, but let me emphasize again, the main point is that this is a strategic relationship. It may not be strategy in how we understand strategy, but it is strategic from their perspective. It is long-term, and therefore remains a key challenge for us in the West as we try to counter both Russian aggression in Syria, but also ongoing escalation in the Middle East that is driven by Iran and Iranian proxies. I'd like to use the remainder of my time very briefly to make a few points about what steps we need to take, and also to make a few comments on the excellent report that is going to be presented in the next session, the report that talks about Russia's destabilizing role in NATO's southern neighborhood, and I'll explain why. But first, in terms of what steps we need to take. First, we need to raise the costs for Russia for its war in Ukraine. And we need to raise the costs for Russia across the globe. Because, see, Russia is looking at this situation from a global perspective. Therefore, we need to look at the situation from a global perspective as well. We need to look at linkages between Russia's ability to wage war in Ukraine and what it's doing in the Middle East, and how do we reduce Russia's efforts to do this. By the same token, we need to do the same thing with Iran and look for raising the costs for Iranian meddling in the region, and look for ways to strengthen our deterrence capabilities. We also need to discredit the Russian narrative, along with the Ukrainian narrative, Iranian narrative, excuse me, frankly. It's been a long day across the Middle East. If anything, the region needs to hear more of the Ukrainian narrative. That is one thing that the Middle East that simply does not hear enough. And with that in mind, let me make a few comments on the report. It dovetails on what steps we need to take. Certainly, this report makes excellent points. I've seen this report prior to its release, and one thing I would have emphasized more is the strategic nature of the threat. And the point that while Russia certainly often acts from a position of weakness, Russia nonetheless remains a long-term security challenge. And just because Russia is acting from a position of weakness doesn't mean we need to discount its role. We need to take it very, very seriously. And it is because of the importance of this long-term security threat that we need to raise the costs for Russian meddling across the globe. With that, I'll end, and I'm happy to answer any questions about Russia in the Middle East or Russia in general. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. And now I will turn to Dr. Ricardo Alcaro, right?
Yeah,
Alcaro, who is a research coordinator and head of the Global Actors Program at the Institute of International Affairs here in Rome. Dr. Alcaro has previously been a visiting fellow at the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C., and he joins us here today to discuss Iran's shifting foreign policy approach vis-à-vis Europe and the Gulf. Ricardo, you have the floor, please.
Here, yes. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and vorrei cominciare ringraziando il Presidente Cesa per l'invito, per l'organizzazione di questo.
First and foremost, I would like to thank Mr. Cesa for inviting me to take part in this meeting. I'll now switch to English.
Yeah, so I have, when I was asked to speak before this audience, I thought about how I could make this intervention interesting, which was quite a challenge because I knew I would have been at the end of the very long program, and during which Iran would have come up quite often, and I did not have the Russia angle to make it even more interesting. So I thought, let's tell a story. So you will forgive me if I go back a bit in time to shed some light on Iran's strategic choices today. So let me start, however, with a photograph of what is the situation now between Iran and Europe, and Iran and the Gulf and the Arab Gulf countries. So Europe-Iran relations, EU-Iran relations now are at a low point. Trade has collapsed. Political interactions have been reduced to the very bare minimum. Official rhetorics from European governments is extremely confrontational, and so is the Iranian official rhetoric too. We have heard from the previous speaker, well, actually, we have heard in the previous session what European main complaints, so to speak, main concerns about Iran are. Let me just list them very briefly. Again, first, Iran's abysmal human rights records. Second, the provision of drones and drone manufacturing know-how to what has now become Europe's main foe, Russia, which has been using those military assets to hit civilian targets in Ukraine. Then, of course, Iran is the main source of anti-US, anti-Western, very much confrontational towards Israel force in the region. And finally, last but not least, the nuclear program, of which we haven't been talking much about. However, the Iranians also have some complaints about the Europeans. They accuse the Europeans of double standards because how could you not? They accuse the Europeans of being subordinate to the hegemonic designs of the United States and of not being able to carve out an autonomous room of action as they seem to be striving for in the early 2000s when the Europeans were the ones who first reached out to the Iranians over the nuclear issue. And finally, and most importantly, the Iranians are furious with the Europeans because of the European inability to keep the United States inside the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or JCPOA, more commonly known as the Iran Nuclear Agreement. Switching to Iran's relations with the Gulf Arab countries, well, here the situation is quite different. I would not say the relationship is good. I would say the relationship is better than it has been in quite a few years. It is definitely more stable, and it has proved to be more stable in these past 6 months. Now, when we say GCC countries, we should distinguish between those countries, because Oman and Qatar are countries which Iran sees as trusted interlocutors, as countries it can use as a conduit to convey messages to the Americans, for instance. Whereas the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia clearly have a more rivalry-oriented relationship with Iran, and they continue to have that kind of understanding of their relations with Iran. It is not a friendly relationship, but it is not, as Cinzia said in the previous session, all about confrontation. It is also about some form of engagement and détente. So how did we get here? How did we get to a situation in which Europe-Iran relations have gone as south goes, and Iran, Arab Gulf countries, and especially Iran-Saudi, Iranian-Saudi, Iranian-Emirati relations have improved considerably, even while remaining fundamentally not friendly, let's say. And the question is interesting because a few years ago, you had a quite different situation. So the European relations were on an upward trajectory, and Iranian-Arab Gulf relations were on a downward trajectory. And we do not need to go that far back in time to get that picture. This was the mid-2010s, more specifically 2016, when the JCPOA, January that year, eventually became fully operational, having been struck in July of 2015. Now, being on an upward trajectory doesn't mean that the relations were good, but surely it was a quite different atmosphere from what you have now. At the time, Iran's strategic calculus, which was a calculus that had been gaining enough consensus across the various power centers that make up the decision-making process inside Iran, had come to a conclusion that in order for Iran to maintain and expand what they call the strategic independence of the country, they needed a foreign policy that was orientated both towards the East, Russia and China, but also with some conditions towards the West and especially Europe. Now, the orientation towards the East was uncontroversial inside Iran. The orientation towards the West was controversial, was contested, was resisted, but in the end, the political establishment managed to find enough consensus. The idea was that for Iran not to be excessively dependent on Russia and China, Iran would need some form of opening towards the West too. And the West meant especially Europe, because the United States was, under Obama, willing to envisage, to contemplate a limited nuclear non-proliferation agreement, but was not really willing to go much further, at least at that stage, whereas the Europeans were fine with the idea of re-establishing normalized economic relations, which they had cut in order to press the Iranians to make a compromise on the nuclear issue. So sanctions relief, which the Iranians were after, was definitely a means for the Iranians to get some economic respite, but it was also a means for the Iranians to remove the stigma that UN, EU, and US sanctions had imprinted on it, and it was finally a strategic choice to expand the foreign policy options of Iran. That doesn't mean that Iran was ready to change its foreign policy course, absolutely not, but it meant that for the Iranians, they would have more choices than otherwise. The missing link in this strategic calculus was the regional dimension. The Iranians were convinced they could force, so to speak, their own view of regional governance on the Gulf onto the Gulf Arab states. And boy, was that a mistake. In fact, the Iranians made 3 mistakes when they applied this strategic calculus to their foreign policy. The first one was exactly this one that I just mentioned. They really underestimated the kind of resistance and opposition to the JCPOA that Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates had. Of course, Israel was also very much opposed to that, but they had, that was part already of the calculus. The second mistake they made was that they underestimated the, let me see, sorry. They underestimated the strength of the anti-Iran and anti-JCPOA forces inside the United States. And the third mistake, which is very much related to the first 2 ones, is that they overestimated the Europe's ability to keep the United States inside the JCPOA had a Republican become president, notwithstanding the fact that all Republican nominees for presidency in 2016 were very much on the record saying they would quit the JCPOA. Trump did become president and did quit the JCPOA unilaterally in May 2018, in spite of the fact that the other members of the JCPOA were fine with the deal, because the deal, from their point of view, was doing what it was supposed to do, which was to keep a lead on Iran's nuclear program. So let me make a leap towards, towards now what is, how has the Iranian strategic calculus changed between 2019 and 2022? It has changed as follows. It is now about 3 main, there are 3 main pillars, so to speak, that keep this strategic calculus in place. One is the strengthening, so doubling down on relations with both Russia and China. And as Anna was saying before, now you have a relationship with Russia and Iran in which Iran is not just the weak links. There has been a degree of rebalancing within the interdependent relationship between the two. And you can even say something about that, something like that about China, because China is the main, I think, as far as I know, the only buyer of Iranian oil, and it gets that at a discount. So for China, it is important to keep its relationship with Iran in place. The second pillar is to confront the United States and Israel much more forcefully. And in order to do that, the Iranians, and the third element, let me just say that in the beginning, is the stabilization of relations with the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia. So now I've been asked to wrap up. So I would be very happy to elaborate on all 3 points. So the strengthening of relations with China and Russia, although we have, someone who's much more expert than I am on Russia, and even on China, Camille is much better than I am, on the more forceful confrontation of the US and Israel in the region, and what the stabilization of relations with the Emirates and with Saudi Arabia can actually entail for the Iranians. So I would leave that to the Q&A, because I've already seen many hands go up. Sorry,
thank you.
Too long,
No. Thank you, Ricardo. And now I will open the floor for questions and comments, starting with Theo Franken, please.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you so much for your two keynotes. It was very interesting. My former report, my first report as a rapporteur, was on the role of Iran in the Middle East and in the world. I think it was very interesting, but the only thing I miss is what now. So the lesson I have, okay, we have to, it's a global thing, we have to see it's globally. We have to increase the price that Russia and Iran are paying for this war. Okay, that's pretty theoretical. I would say it in English, zeer theoretisch, as you. But what now? Because they are launching a lot of missiles towards Israel. Israel is doing everything to fight back, but they're pretty much alone. They have the United States. In Europe, there's a lot of anti-Israel sentiment. A lot of anti-Israel sentiment in my country as well. I don't understand it, but it is just how it is. So where is this going? First of all, I think that public opinion in Europe and NATO and Western Alliance is just asking one question: where is this going? Is this going to a third world war? Will there be a war between Tehran and Tel Aviv? A real war, not a cyber war or a hybrid war, but a full-fledged war? How do you see that? And then on GCPOA, can we conclude that it is a total failure? Can that be the conclusion? It is my personal opinion, but I don't know what is your opinion, that it's a total failure. They only enrich their uranium program. They're just not following any of those measures. And we were so naive, also European countries, that we still believe that GCPOA will turn out on the good side. It will not happen. That's not how I think it will evolve. So some questions about, okay, what needs to be the agenda of NATO in this game? Thank you.
And I will also get one more question from Oleksiy from Ukraine, please.
Thank you very much. I want to raise more deep problem, not only the relationship between authorities of the governments, but some processes within societies of the countries, in West countries and not West countries. Firstly, I want to emphasize that Ukraine's victory defending against Russia is a key factor in stabilizing the situation, not only in this region, but in another region on the globe. Because only a few decades ago, the collective West was a role model for the other nations. Its military strength was unquestionable, and it was a moral authority for many developing countries. But now the West is losing its leadership and inability to swiftly resolve the problem within own borders of the Western world. I mean, in Ukraine, sends the signal for not only for authoritarian regimes in the globe, but for societies that the democracy, human rights, and other so-called civilizational attributes of the West is no more guarantee the peace or prosperity. And that's why there are no reasons for other society to push some changes in their countries. And it's pushed this society to to keep the regimes, the current autocratic regimes. And do you agree with this, that the situation in Ukraine is some kind of examine, a test for a Western world, and the choice between these two narratives, weak West or strong role model West?
Thank you. All right, I'll start with the first question about where does this go? What does this all mean, and about raising costs? You raise an excellent point. I mean, that is the question that I think about a lot as well. Where does this all go? The problem is that we, on the one hand, I think the West collectively has understood correctly that Russia has to be stopped in Ukraine, because if Russia is not stopped in Ukraine, it will not end in Ukraine. This war is going to spread. But we haven't taken that in terms of next steps to its logical conclusion. And it's very hard to do, because this is an enormous challenge of Russia waging the war in Ukraine and how it's impacting the entire world, because the war in Ukraine is affecting everyone. And the way to do it is, well, how do nations start fighting, really? You know, we haven't even answered the most basic questions as, what does victory look like? What does a loss look like? But from my perspective, analytically, Russia to this day has not been able to lose enough resources to end the war. In other words, from their perspective, not only is the cost of fighting the war affordable, they really can't afford not to fight, because you're seeing how the Russian economy is. The Russian political structure and also Russian economy is turning more and more towards militarization. Russia is really headed towards a military dictatorship, and its entire economy is now concentrated around the military-industrial complex, which is why, frankly, sanctions have not, to this day, been able to cause as much damage to Russia's ability to wage war as some had expected. So what that means is, so how do you raise the costs? How do you force your adversary to expend more resources and in more theaters than they'd like to do? And this is not a theoretical idea, it's a very practical idea. This is how you get somebody to lose, when they reach a point where they simply have no more resources to fight, when the cost of fighting is no longer worth it. And you need to look at ways to push Russia to overextend its resources in other theaters, on a diplomatic realm, on a political realm, on an information realm, and certainly to some extent on a military realm. That's one of the reasons why I mentioned the Middle East and the South Caucasus. The South Caucasus is a very interesting and part of the world where Russia has held a very strong military and political position and economic position for over 200 years. But if you discredit Russia, if you discredit Russia's vision of the world as an alternative, as a losing one, if you show that Russia can be defeated, and if Russia reaches a point where they can no longer fight because they have to put out small fires across the globe, that's when you can really start having a negotiation, when you put Russia in a position of loss, as opposed to a negotiation when Russia is in a position of strength. And to the second point about the collective West, I very much agree that the war in Ukraine is a test for the rest of the world. And I also very much agree that the West used to be a model. I was born in the Soviet Union. I left Russia as a child, as a refugee. And I certainly remember my parents seeing the West as the model. And that is the reason why I emphasize narrative so much is precisely to your point, because so much of the world no longer sees the West as the model the way my parents used to see it during the Cold War. And that is the reason why Russia is winning in the global South, why countries outside the liberal free world simply do not buy our version of the war in Ukraine. They do not, and I can go in a lot more detail about this if necessary, but this is why these points are so interconnected, why Ukraine and the Middle East are completely interconnected. And from a practical perspective, why Russia, by aligning with the global South that does not buy our narrative of the war in Ukraine, Russia is able to find more resources to fight.
Well, I would like to pick up where Anna left off, because for once there is some disagreement on the panel. I do not think that the European front and the Middle Eastern front are just one single front running from the Arctic to the Indian Ocean. I know this is not a popular opinion here, but this is how I see things. Because the problem with the war of narratives in the global south, so to speak, I mean, if you want to use that expression, which the West is losing, is not only about the inability of the West to articulate a more compelling narrative about what is happening in Ukraine. It is about the fact that Russian promoted narratives in Africa, in South America, in Central America, in Southeast Asia, in Asia, even inside Europe, and now increasingly so within a small but not insignificant section of the US public, do strike a chord because they point to actual policies carried out by the West, to actual positions espoused by the West. And while Russia's propaganda twisted those policies and twist those positions, it is not that the rest of the world is entirely naive and incapable of articulating its own public opinion. When they accuse the West of double standards, it is because the West does apply double standards. So let me go back to the question of how important is Ukraine as a test for the West? I would say it is existential. In Europe, we are facing the greatest challenge, not just to the security of the continent, but to the very idea of order we have in Europe. It is, I mean, the stakes could not be bigger. Of course, this is the biggest challenge since the Cold War. That's a piece I missed to mention. But in Europe, we have a clear-cut division between NATO/the EU plus Ukraine and Moldova, and Russia, on the other hand, which has basically integrated Belarus into its security and military system. In Europe, the blocks, the opposing fronts are in a way homogeneous. We really have different views of what order in Europe means, and the bone of contention, Ukraine, is you either defend Ukraine or you not. And for now, at least, and I hope for many years to come, the West has been supporting Ukraine and should have been supporting Ukraine even more than it has been doing so far, much more. So I am pretty hawkish on Russia in Europe, but I do not think that applying the same paradigm to the Middle East is really going to help us, whatever we believe. We may disagree with the idea of whether the paradigm should be, I mean, is in fact the same, but I can tell you it is not going to help us very much, because in the Middle East, the division lines are not as clear-cut. Even Iran is not seen as an enemy by most countries we call allies or partners in the Middle East, of course, with the exception of Israel, but even the greatest rivals of Iran, Saudi Arabia, the greatest Arab rivals of Iran, Saudi Arabia and the Emirates, have normalized relations with Iran or are in the process of normalizing relations with Iran, and they assign greater priority to regional stability than they do to regime change in Iran, to confronting Iran forcefully. When it comes to Russia, no country in the Middle East sees Russia as we do, because Russia is not their foe, it is our foe. And when it comes to China, I'm mentioning these three countries because especially this morning I have listened to several speakers saying we are facing a global alignment of enemies, Russia, Iran, China, and of course their minions, North Korea or Venezuela or Nicaragua or Cuba. But the reality is that China is not perceived, not even as a problematic country for the Arab Gulf states, and not only the Arab Gulf states. If we want to fight back against anti-Western narrative in Africa, we are not going to, in Africa or the Middle East, we are not going to win that narrative by saying, oh, well, you know what, Russia and Iran should be your enemies as they are our own enemies, and you know what, you should not trade or get investments trade with China or get investment from China as much as you do now. You should do that with us only. This is not going to work. It is not going to work in Africa. It is not going to work even in the Middle East, because as I think Ambassador Massolo rightly said this morning, the reality is that our interest in Europe is to fight back against Russia, is to keep Ukraine safe, secure. If we don't manage to help Ukraine reconquer its lost territory, we should at least immediately bring it into NATO and turn the contact line, the front line now, into a sort of informal, fully militarized border, the way we did with West Germany. But in the Middle East, in the greater Middle East, I mean, so the Gulf region included, our interests are more in regional stability than in confronting forcefully Russia and Iran and risking a military regional conflagration. And Mr. Franken, Theo, if I may, I would love to spend 1 hour with you, but not now, to tell you why the JCPOA was a great deal. It was a triumph of multilateral diplomacy, and exiting from the JCPOA is as big a strategic blunder for the United States as it was the invasion of Iraq in 2003.
I just have a two-point clarification, if I may. I'm actually not hearing a whole lot of disagreement. Okay. My point was, I very much agree that the region perceives Russia, China, and Iran completely differently from us. That is actually exactly my point, that the region does not see any of these issues, Ukraine, Russia, Iran, China, as we do. My point is simply that Russia is looking to challenge the entire liberal world order, which includes, of course, specifically the European security structure. So it's looking to renegotiate the world order and specifically the post-Cold War European security architecture. And I'm not calling for, I apologize, I don't remember exactly how you phrased it. I'm not calling for a military challenge of Russia and Iran in the Middle East, but rather for creative ways to look to deplete Russia's ability to fight war through slowly bleeding it of its resources across the globe. Those are very different ideas.
Okay, sorry, yeah. I misunderstood.
Thank you. And the list is closed, and I have 3 questions. I will have Nigel from UK.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you for the very interesting presentations and the discussion so far. We've talked about the cost of the war in Ukraine for Russia, but what more can be done to increase the cost for Iran of its activities and what was described by our Israeli colleague as the soft reaction or no reaction in some cases of Iranian terrorism and attacks, direct attacks on other countries. And just as one example, it's been raised in this seminar already today about, for instance, the EU adding the IRGC to the list of prohibited, banned terrorist organisations. What would be the effect on relations between European countries and Iran if that were to take place? Because our Foreign Secretary, Lord Cameron, has said recently to our Parliament that this would be a negative thing to do, although there are many others who say that it is the very least that we should be doing in the current circumstances. Thank you.
Andrea from Italy.
I will speak in Italian, so you must use your headphones. Grazie per queste.
Thank you very much. Thank you for these very important presentations. I have a question concerning the fact that the Gulf countries, especially Saudi Arabia, are coming closer to Iran. I feel that this is in a way also sponsored by China, and I find it very worrying. Worrying because we see a broadening of the Chinese influence, and worrying because Saudi Arabia is and was a crucial interlocutor with the West as well. And therefore, maybe Saudi Arabia remains fundamental that it has to adhere to something similar as the Abraham Accords. But the fact that Saudi Arabia is coming closer to Iran stems from a lack of confidence of Saudi Arabia vis-à-vis the West. And I believe this is due to four reasons. First, the Obama administration's agreement, the GCPOA, which was done by ignoring Saudi Arabia all along the process. Second, the attitude of the Biden administration at the beginning of his mandate, when he condemned some senior Saudi officials after this situation with the journalists, and when the US reviews its relations with Saudi Arabia. Thirdly, from a strategic point of view, on the US and the EU side as well, we didn't really help Saudi Arabia in the conflicts against the Houthi rebels. So much so that we limited the aid given to Saudi Arabia in such a way that it wasn't able to intervene against the rebels. Fourth, the withdrawal from Afghanistan. This led to a great mistrust vis-à-vis the Western presence. And therefore, I'm wondering if this is not jeopardizing our tie with Saudi Arabia, if it's not putting it at risk. I wonder if you share my assessment, or if you have a different opinion.
And finally, Boaz from Israel.
Thank you. I must admit that I'm reconforted by what I hear right now, because the speaker just now from Italy says exactly the things that we said, or I said even today, and we say for years. And also my friend from Belgium, when he speaks about the Iranian deal, in order not to say the GCPOA, how funny, and I'm talking to you directly, Mr. Alcaro, I wonder, I mean, maybe I misunderstood you, and maybe I didn't. If I did, I'm worried. I'll tell you why. Because how come countries that are involved, engaged, or threatened by the Iranian nuclear project, Saudi Arabia, Emirates, Israel, for example, are very much concerned by the deal. Now, you said that you're going to share an hour with your friend in order to explain to him, but we don't need an hour. Forget the fact that the Iranian deal is 15 years. After 15 years, they can do whatever they want. Forget the deal that the ballistic missiles are not there. You will discuss with me, I wonder, I guess. But there is one point, and we're now in Europe, we're now in NATO, and there is something that you totally don't take into consideration. There is something that we, you Europeans, and we sitting here with you, should respect and should put on the contrary in front, calls values. Values. We should be proud of our values. Now, when Iran comes with values which are totally in opposition with the values of Europe, human rights, women's rights, gay rights, any rights whatsoever, and you sign a nuclear deal with Iran, meaning what? Meaning you go to a revolutionary regime, and as you know perfectly better than me, revolutions never stop. In fact, what do? You tell a revolutionary regime, come, I embrace you, join, you're with me. This is exactly what you did. On the 14th of, when was that? 14th of July, 2015 in Vienna. In fact, you accepted a revolutionary regime, a Shiite regime, a regime that respects zero right whatsoever to the international community. And this is already something that was shocking. Now let me tell you another thing. In 1994, there was a very great president that we appreciate, all of us. His name is Bill Clinton, 1994. He came and he said, that's it, we have a deal. North Korea will not be nuclear. I'm asking you a question, North Korea is not nuclear? This is why your romantic view, I appreciate a lot, I'm also very romantic, you can ask my wife. But one has to be a bit cautious when you search for stability in a region. And when you speak of Iran, and only to show you how much, I mean, we did not expect wars right now. We didn't even want wars, and this is NATO, we seek stability and peace. We have 2 wars in parallel. One of them, I'm concerned, we are concerned. It's called war against terrorism in Gaza. Another one is Ukraine, Russia. A country not respecting the sovereignty of another. How odd it is that in both conflicts, we find a country called Iran. So if this is not enough in order to see that this is destabilizing, and when you make this difference between the conflict in Russia or Ukraine and the conflict in the Middle East, as if the Middle East, I mean, the fact that the country is not accepted, its sovereignty is not accepted by Iran, is something that we can live with it, you know, peacefully, tranquilly. This is something that, of course, as an Israeli, I cannot accept, and I don't think that anyone here can accept. I will only add another thing. When you mentioned Saudi Arabia, and you also showed this also romantic view between Saudi Arabia and Iran, on the contrary, relations were bad. Now it's getting better. They might even go to the movies together. Let me remind you one thing. In September, just before, a few weeks before the 7th of October, there was the Assembly General of the UN, if you recall. And MBS, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, gave an interview to Fox News. And what did he say over there? Saudi Arabia was, you know, approaching the Abraham Accords. Then we had the 7th of October. And I will add that I will conclude by the last thing concerning the Iranian, the nuclear deal that my friend from Belgium and myself, and I believe many others, did not like and are worried about it. You know, when Israel opposed it, and when Prime Minister of Israel, Netanyahu, went to the Congress in order to oppose Mr. Obama's deal, how funny. This is how the Abraham Accord were born. Thank you very much, sir. Just the last word. You mentioned, I have to conclude. You mentioned Qatar, and you said Qatar and Oman are friendly with Iran in the region. Qatar only we have to add, and I'll conclude by that. We Israelis, unfortunately, learned it too late, but it's unbelievable how Qatar, a country, yes, it's close to Iran, it can be also close to America, because they invented something that they deserve the Nobel Prize. How can you be at the same time a pyroman and a fireman? But that's just a comment. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Well, I'll try to address these questions quickly. In terms of what can be done more to deter Iran, well, I'll give an example. Last summer, when we saw an increased escalation, horizontal escalation in Syria by Russia and Iran against U.S. forces, we sent F-35s to the region. And it had a temporary, I want to emphasize temporary calming effect. The problem is when it comes to issues of deterrence, again, you can't take a step and make an action like that and then think that this is the end. You have to keep doing it over and over again, and that's why that sending of F-35 was a good step in the right direction, but it was not enough. I mean, I think what the rest of the world is also seeing is when you look at Houthis' action across the Red Sea is you don't need a lot of resources to destabilize world trade. You just need to take some cheap drones and put them in strategic points across global trade routes, and you get the United States to expend very expensive military hardware to counter them, right? So you need to counter these efforts. You need to show that you can't keep doing this. You can't just take it costs a lot to go against the United States, we're not, I mean, I'll be the first one to say we have not done that enough. In my view, we have not done enough to deter Iran. Also, and let me wrap up on the bigger picture globally, again, and why Ukraine and the Middle East are interconnected. When our adversaries see that we're not succeeding in one theater, it is going to embolden them. So if if Russia continues to be able to wage aggressive war in Ukraine, and Ukrainians are losing resources, that is also going to embolden Iran and our other adversaries. So we also need to drive Russia towards a loss in Ukraine. That in itself will also have a deterrent effect on Iran.
Oh, okay. So I would respond first to your question, and lo vorrei fare in italiano così che possiamo avere direttamente un'interazione.
I'll do so in Italian, if I may. No, I do like having direct dialogue. So here we are, two Italians speaking to each other. All the reasons you brought forward. Well, there is one reason which is extremely decisive in increasing Saudi Arabian distrust in the US. The Trump administration did not react when Aramco was attacked by drones. Could have been Houthis, could have been Iran, but anyway, Aramco was is attacked, and the Trump administration did not react. And what did Mohammed bin Salman do? He really changed course. He was forced to reinterpret his competitive situation vis-à-vis Iran, and promote some form of regional stability to be able to pursue our line of development, thought Mohammed bin Salman. So reduce Iran's influence in that way. Now, we're not talking about mistrust as such, but China is too important for Saudi Arabia. So trust or mistrust doesn't count there. Think of China's purchase of hydrocarbons, for instance. For Saudi Arabia, it was really a master blow to land the Chinese market. They were outside. They just got out of a very heavy conflict with Iraq, with Iran, and they managed to strike to get this deal. So they had someone there whom they could deal with. And by getting China to intervene, they upped the cost of this. Same for Iran. They also complicate matters. This also complicated matters for Saudi Arabia. So China does not guarantee this agreement, but its presence was decisive in this agreement between Saudi Arabia and Iran. With other states in the regions, granted, but these two countries do see China as being some form of guarantor of this agreement. Now, globally, you can think in terms of loss, but China did play a part which the US was unable or unwilling to play. And Europe had absolutely no negotiating strength at all. So China played its hand well, and cemented this relationship between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Now, I believe, you may disagree, but I think it's positive that we have in this region this situation, this stability, this axis of stability to prevent a war.
Even if I do not advocate for a regime change policy or for the maximum pressure policy adopted by Trump, that doesn't imply that I have a romanticized view of Iran. It is just that, based purely on what I think is realistically the best way to pursue my own country's and Europe's interest, I think that a a balance, a combination of deterrence and some form of very limited engagement work best. I take note that you think differently. I mean, the Iran nuclear issue is something I've been dealing for 20 years. Opinions are extremely polarized. We don't have now the time to sit down and enumerate all the arguments pro and cons. I would just like you to think that at least I'm not a romantic. That's it. That's the amount of agreement we can get to. Okay? And the one issue on, yes, you raised one point about values, okay? And it is difficult to bring in the value dimension. That's why I was emphasizing the realistic elements for us, because it is not just Iran that does not share our values in that region, and many other countries that also don't share our values. We consider partners.
So that concludes our panel. A big thank you to our two experts and to all of you for your questions and remarks, indeed. And I will now give the moderator's chair once again.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
No.
Thank you so much.
Now, I'll now give the moderator's chair once again to our chairman, Fernando Guterres, as we move to our final agenda item for today.
I'll tell you after.
All right. Okay. Let us now turn to our final point in the discussion of the day. The presentation of this is our favorite, by the way, the presentation of the annual GSM report that this year is titled Russia's Destabilizing Role in NATO's Southern Neighborhood. Last year report made by the same rapporteur, Theo Franken, was referring to Iran, so it's interesting. And in this year report, you will find in the paragraph 66 the references to Iran, which will be interesting for the Israeli representation, because there's another view presented in this report. The report has been diligently put together by Theo Franken from Belgium. As Russia continues to sow discord and play the stabilizing role across NATO's southern flank, this report is both timely and an important contribution to our government's perspectives on how we shape our overall deterrence and defense postures, so they fit the Alliance's 360-degree approach to security. Following the presentation of the report, we will have a general discussion and comments on the text will be recorded for the consideration in the final version that, as I said this morning, will be drafted during the summer to be presented in the autumn session. All right, Theo, the floor is yours. You can give us on your report.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Chair, Fernando, good friends. We were 100 this morning, now we think we're 20 or something. So the only thing between dinner in a 2-star restaurant, I heard, and this moment is so I'm going in between. So the report, first of all, I think it's very good that we keep on working on Mediterranean issues, because there's a lot of attention going on and focalizing on Ukraine and the war, the devastating war, of course, and that's just the way it has to be. We need to talk about our eastern border, we need to talk about Ukraine. But then again, I'm happy to also have attention and NATO PA keep on reporting about what's happening on the southern flank, because the world is not standing still only at the eastern border of NATO alliance. Oh, it's really noisy. So I hope that that we can keep on talking about southern flank, and we can keep on reporting about southern flank. First of all, second, when we talked about the last report that was voted and was with some amendments we passed that. I think it's good that the second report is about the influence, the malign influence of Russia and Russian Federation in Northern Africa and MENA region and Middle East, of course. The report is extensive, like all reports Matthew and Paul make. It's a super strong report. Thank you very much. I think it's pretty much the last report for Paul, so give him a warm applause for his very intense work. Paul is with us for long years and is really working on a very good report. It's always been a pleasure to work with you. It's always a pleasure to work with you, Paul, because you always have good ideas. You're following geopolitics as no one else does, and you have a lot of experience to do that, and you have a very good pen. He was like a writer, and when you see the reports of Paul, you always see that there's a really writing ambition through the reports. And when you see other NATO and NATO PA reports, you almost fall asleep when you read them. But when Paul makes a report, it's I don't know. You have to read it. People that didn't read it yet, please read it. You will not fall asleep. So it's a nice report. Also, Matthew, thank you very much. Matthew made keynote speech. I'm not giving it because otherwise we're talking for 1 hour and there's a debate. So Matthew, sorry for that. But I give you some conclusions. And of course there will be questions. And there's some amendments from the Turkish delegation. I know Mr. Mehmet, I don't know, maybe he's gone, I don't know, but there's some I will go there deep into as well. First, the report, of course, is about malign influence of Russia, increasing influence in Northern Africa and Middle Eastern countries. We talked about it all day. We will talk about it tomorrow as well. Is that a fact? It is absolutely a fact. You cannot deny it. It is increasing, and they are challenging the West at all our borders. We had Wagner mercenaries. We have them still. Even though the head of Wagner fall out of a plane, is still they're still in action in African countries, although they're more integrated within the Russian army, traditional and Russian army, but they're still active. They're active in Central African Republic, they're active in Mali, they're active in Burkina Faso, in Niger. That was pretty much the last stronghold of the French. And the Belgian in Africa, we lost that as well. So the situation is really bad. There was a very interesting remark that we had from the French colleague. I don't know if he's still here. Who said that yes, there's a malign influence of Russia in those countries, but we also have to do an introspective remark we also made mistakes. Just only pointing out towards Russia to see that Mali fell or Burkina Faso has fallen. It's not the only thing we can do. We also have to make an evaluation of our own position and what we do good and the things that we did wrong in the Sahel region. And there's some issues that went wrong as well. First of all, what was actually the Western Sahel strategy from the beginning? That's one thing that I asked a lot of questions within Belgian Parliament. I didn't really get a good response, but okay. Then on the conclusions, I think it's very important that the role of Russia in the greater Middle East is deeply concerning. But we have to recognize that the Kremlin is not operating from a position of strength. It does not have the strategic resources to replace the United States as the region's most important external power broker, and it lacks the economic weight of the European Union or the kind of historical ties to the region that Turkey enjoys. And I think that is one thing. Yes, we are under threat, but under pressure, but we're stronger. We keep on being stronger. European Union, we are an economic power broker. America is an industrial and military absolutely top, and that keeps on being. Russia is not at the same level, but they're more malign. That's true, and they're respecting no rules. That's also true. But African countries know that as well. So I think that we need to we cannot be like, we have to be realistic but not depressive, because we need to focalize on our strength, and we have a lot of strength, certainly in the European Union. We are here for so many decades, engaging on the economic, on the diplomatic and all the other sides with African countries, with Northern African countries, and we're not doing always a good job, but most of the time we're doing a really good job. And I see a lot of European leaders going to those countries to make, for example, agreements on the economic cooperation, but also on migration, was very sensitive. Return policy, very sensitive. My government was in Morocco last week to make an agreement with Morocco on return and migration issues. It's very sensitive, but we have a lot of tradition. And that's a good thing, and we need to emphasize it as well, not only talk about the bad things. So that's one of the conclusions, and I think it's a positive conclusion, and we need to go further on that road. And then we have Turkey, who is a very strong and important partner for NATO and the Western Alliance in the MENA region. There's a lot of issues within NATO, sometimes about the position of Turkey when we talk about North Syria, about some other issues. But at the end of the day, they're a NATO ally for long decades, and they're doing a great job in a very difficult region, probably the most difficult region of the world. Now I said that, and there's nobody from Turkey. Oh, there is somebody. Okay, sorry. Then President Putin has committed Russia's resources and its own future to his war against Ukraine, compelling Moscow to exploit opportunities and project influence elsewhere on the cheap. Because Russia's intention is to foster chaos on the southern flank, it can play the asymmetric card to its advantage. Putin, like his predecessors, often finds these openings during moments of crisis. And then, of course, we need to talk about Syrian civil war and everything that started there, and the position of Syria on the Mediterranean region. So that's some of the conclusion as well. It's more elaborated within the report. You can read it. And then what we're going to do, what are the concrete measures we can take? There are 4 concrete measures. First of all, reinforcing the alliance 360-degree approach to security, particularly at the moment when security threats along the eastern and southern flanks are increasingly interconnected. This should raise the level of focus on the southern region, the stability of which is becoming ever less sub-strategic and more strategic in essence, and therefore demands a more intensive focus. Anna was talking about the fact that we were in the report, we were lacking the strategic dimension. I think there is we are focalizing on the strategic dimension. Maybe we can put it a bit more and maybe in the introduction, but I think that in the conclusions we are talking about strategic level. Second remark or conclusion is actively engaging in regional frameworks for dialogue while supporting regional partners in areas like capacity building, counterterrorism, intelligence sharing and social resilience to combat threats to regional peace and stability, like Mr. Romani also told that for the first time in 75 years our Secretary General was talking in Riyadh and had talks with Middle Eastern countries. And we need to do more. And I think that, I hope that in Washington, after 75 years, with our 360 degrees approach, we will have a special officer or a special representative for the South, for NATO. It would be the first time. I don't know who will be that, but I think it's very important that we have somebody who is engaging and doing more diplomatic talks, also on a military basis with southern countries. Third, developing collective responses to counter the destructive role Russia plays in undermining regional stability, weaponizing migration, engaging in human rights abuse, and plundering national resources. Then we're talking about the mercenaries and Wagner groups. It is very, very difficult to tackle them in the south. When there's a coup d'etat and the new regime wants to have a security deal with Wagner, what can we do? I broke my head about that question, but I don't really have a solution. And that's what we see pretty much everywhere. They're trying to take the power. Sometimes they're officers who are trained by Belgian army. It's pretty cynical. Then they force a coup d'etat. They take the power, and then they hire Wagner to protect them. And then Moscow does the opening the champagne in Moscow. And then we see, okay, then we have to leave the country. Within months, they say, okay, now we don't need America anymore, or France, or Belgium, or other countries, or Spain, or Italy. You can leave. It's a big issue, and I don't really have an immediate solution for that, because talking about yes, but it's more we have to act as equal or on the same level. Yeah, but of course, when there's a country like Russia that's never asking questions about human rights, it's giving a lot of comfort. Huh? When there's human rights violations all of the time in some countries on a very high level, and there's a country just pouring Wagner mercenaries to protect the regime and never asking any questions, annoying questions, when we go down that drain, where does that end? Huh? That's not the West. Huh? That's not why I'm elected in a European Parliament or in a Belgian Parliament, in a Parliament of a European country. So I think that's something we need to tackle, but I don't have a real solution. As you see in the report, we're not yet there. But maybe somebody in the room or maybe some people we can elaborate on that, and I'm very glad to hear your remarks or your suggestions on that point. It's pretty much the most essential point. Last fourth point is offering viable alternatives to Russia's brand of outreach through enhanced diplomatic engagement, target foreign aid, information strategies, aiming to counter disinformation and shared efforts to address root causes of regional instability that prioritize needs identified by local partners. So then on the conclusion, that were the four most important points. But then again, as you see, there's a lot of conclusions. And we're also talking about illegal migration. And my president was talking that when you talk about illegal migration in Spain, the word illegal is more like used by extreme right parties. So I will talk about undocumented or irregular migration. I don't want to be offensive on that word. It's not about words. That's not the issue. The issue is that I'm very, very, very concerned of the consequences of irregular migration for decades. I have to adapt. In Belgium, it's not that. You can say illegal migration without being put in the extreme right corner. So, but okay, I'll adapt to my audience. So, on irregular migration, I was 4 years head of a ministry in Belgium. We tried pretty much everything to counter that. It was not easy. I was in Morocco, I was in Algeria, I was with the friends in Tunisia, I was in Turkey with my good friend and had agreement on migration because it was a big crisis, European asylum crisis, 2016. Everybody recalls that period. And it keeps on being a major issue. So we cannot conclude any report on the Mediterranean without talking about the problem of irregular migration. And we're talking about that problem in this report. And it is necessary to talk about this. Finally, we're not talking about the situation in Palestine and Israel. It is a very devastating situation. It is very, very, very difficult. It's just one sentence, one or two sentences in the report. We've tried to be very diplomatic on that because within our alliance and within our countries, home countries, there are a lot of positions about this issue. Somebody's more pro-Israel, somebody's more pro-Palestinian Authority, and we can discuss for days and weeks. We cannot solve this. They need to solve it by themselves, I'm afraid. So I don't think it's the task of NATO to make a report for hours and pages about this issue, so it's just a very small sentence. And concluding by the fact on Iran, and as the President said, Fernando said, we are talking about Iranian support for terrorism, hostage-taking of European civilians, and all the things, the malign things they are doing, and we're really talking about putting Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps on European Union's list of terrorist organizations. So we're doing this in the report. I hope we can find a solution and we can find consensus on that point. That's what I wanted to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Theo. And we have 20 minutes before now on the closing point. We have 3 questions. We are taking the 3 questions one after the other in the same 4 now. 4. We'll take the 4 and 5. This is it. Thank you so much. We'll start with Tommy Monin, Harriet Baldwin, Mevlut Cavusoglu after, our Algerian friend, and Italian. And that will be it. So Tommy, please go.
Thank you, sir. And thank you for Theo about this excellent report and the presentation of yours and all those people which have been participating in creating this report. In Finland, we are using our diplomats to North African countries to enhance the understanding of Russia's influence, of course. And of course, we encourage all the NATO countries to bring up the Russia's role behind the stabilization in MENA area. And just to give a simple example, in Finland we are very used to Russian misinformation operations, so we have been trying to bring up these kind of topics with the African countries when using our expertise. But the final question is that how do you think, what we should do as a NATO PA organization? What kind of recommendations and ideas you would have how we could do more to balance and stabilize this turbulence which is caused by the Russian in MENA area? So you have any hints for us, ourselves, for the NATO PA? What should we do more and how? Thanks.
Yes. Thank you, Tommy. Harriet, please.
Thank you very much, and thank you for a very interesting draft report. And I wondered if I could make a couple of points that might be added to the final version. In terms of Russia's overall strategy, obviously you emphasize the point about disruptive behavior in the Sahel and weaponizing migration into the southern flank. I wonder also if we could put a bit more emphasis in the report on the sort of strategic approach to the various different naval facilities. So clearly the invasion of Crimea was partly so that Russia could secure warm water access, link up with its base in Tartus. And now there are those who suggest that by playing both sides within Sudan, Russia's strategic goal is actually to get a port on the Red Sea and therefore link up all this warm water naval routes. And I wondered if we could put a little bit more about an assessment of their strategic goals in the report.
Thank you. Mevlut Cavusoglu, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I would like to join the colleagues who are thanking Theo for the good report and good work. And thank you very much for recognizing Turkey's stabilizing role in the region, and we will continue cooperating with our partners, including and mainly NATO. Southern flank of NATO is also important, and we have many challenges and threats. And we tabled a couple of amendments to contribute your report. And since we have time to discuss these amendments later on, I don't want to go into the details of all these amendments. Some of them is about the language that we are using in the report. Some of them is about the issues. So we will have, but in two areas, I would like to underline that. First, I appreciate that you recognize that we have different opinion or views on Middle East issue, Gaza and Israel's aggression. But this is a NATO organization, and our report should be balanced and objective instead of reflecting our own emotions. Secondly, there are some terrorist organizations changing their names or adding new organizations to legitimize themselves. So we have to be very vigilant over here as NATO Parliamentary Assembly. So PKK affiliates or affiliates of any other terrorist organization shouldn't be mentioned in our report. This is exactly what they want, so we can discuss the details of all these points later on. Once again, thank you very much for the good work, Theo.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mohamed Amroun, please, from Nigeria. Thank you.
In Arabic. So,
yeah, sorry.
شكرا سيد ثيو على هذا العرض وعلى هذا التقرير.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Theo, for your presentation, and thank you very much for the draft report. We can't hear the speaker. Could the speaker please use a mic? Yes. So thank you. I have 3 comments on the report on the Middle East and Northern Africa. There's a bit of an issue with the mic. This is a comment from the interpreter, so the speaker would just change seats. Thank you. So as I was saying, there are various challenges that we're having to face in the Sahel. There seems to be a lot of aggression towards everything that comes from the West. Over the past few years, we've noticed that the anti-Western sentiment has really grown. So the West has to understand that there are new social categories, that there are young people now that have come into power, that work in politics, and they really want to strengthen national sovereignty. So as I said during the session this morning, our initiatives in the Sahel were really a failure. They failed Now, of course, we don't think that the West is responsible for us failing or for the difficulties we're having to face in our own countries, but we notice a real worsening of situation in Sahel, and that's also due to the behavior of the West. The extreme right parties, for example, are on the rise in Western countries. All of the electoral campaigns seem to focus on others, on Africans, on the Arabs. And that only worsens the situation. It also worsens Islamophobia, I think. So if we really want to create constructive relationships, this has to change. Now, you mentioned the situation in Gaza and Israel. I'll be very honest. I represent a parliament from a southern country, and we feel that really there's a double standard. Since this morning, we've been talking about the hostages and so on and so forth, but no one mentioned the great number of victims in Gaza. How many children were killed? How many women were killed in Gaza? There's a genocide happening in Palestine right now. Everyone condemned the 7th of October attacks, but none of you condemned the other events. So as members of parliament, we represent our people. So look at what is happening in American universities and in European universities. Your people are asking you to change your policies. I think that the Near East, Middle East, Sahel, Northern Africa don't hate others, don't hate the West. We simply ask you to be fairer. You have to be fair. You have the political power, the military power. And so you can really improve the sense of justice. Of course, here we're not just talking about strength, power, but also about the moral responsibility that comes with that power. So we would ask you to listen to us openly and sincerely, because we want to share a position openly and sincerely with you. Thank you.
Formentini from Italy, please.
Grazie. I speak Italian. Ringrazio davvero Theo per...
Thank you. I would like to thank Theo for this excellent report. And I think it's a great report because finally, in one of the NPA's report, we speak of weaponization of migration as a form of hybrid war. And it's written that not only does it concern the conflict between Russia and Finland, but also the Mediterranean basin. And a few years ago, we didn't even mention it, but now it's something that we observe on the ground, and therefore we must take into account this weaponization of migration. And here I would like to ask Theo if it would be possible to insist even more on the role of the south of Europe in the alliance. Because we know that the way we are seen by the South is not very favorable. And we also need to maybe better use the hub for the South. And it's also a question based on the Italian national interest. But I think it's also a strategic issue, which is of interest to all of NATO.
To answer in a couple of minutes, because there was, we were talking about very important issues, and I'm very happy as well that we have this meeting, and thank you, Lorenzo, for hosting us here in this beautiful parliament, because sometimes I'm a bit frustrated when we have NATO PA parliamentary meetings that we don't have the time to talk about the South. We talk about it, but it's only 1 or 2 sessions, and we talk because the challenges are so enormous, and we have to talk about Ukraine. It's priority number one. Let that be very clear. But we need more time to talk about the South because, of course, it is very, very important. First of all, on Tommy, on work, what can we do more? I think that we need to, as a NATO PA, we need to do this more. Coming to Rome, it took some time. We had Corona, we had the problems that we were facing. We have Ukraine that was pretty much taking all our energy. But I'm so happy that with the new Italian delegation and with the fact that Italy is really trying to reach out to Northern Africa, and it's your policy of your government, and you're doing a lot. We see your Prime Minister going pretty much everywhere in North Africa, and was in Albania 2 weeks ago. She had made a deal with Mr. Rama there. We met with Mr. Rama. So she's very, very active, and I think that's important that the Italian delegation takes this role and takes also the lead in all the debates, together with, of course, Spain, and together with, of course, France and Greece and Portugal. Let that be very clear. So can we do more? Hopefully we're going to Algeria in the autumn. I hope so, that we can fix the date, and then we will come. Hopefully, we're trying to have an agenda where we're really focalizing on Northern Africa and Mediterranean and Middle East. So we're doing visits. Normally we're going to Israel. We have the invitation. Normally we go to Jordan to talk also with Palestinian on the Palestinian, because we always have to talk with the two sides. Let that be very clear. So we need to do more, and I hope to see you, everybody, every single of you. I hope to see you there. Because only by also with NATO PA going there and showing respect, showing engagement, showing our trust, that will increase relationships and increase trust. I think that's pretty much what we need to do. This is what we're doing. I'm a member for 14 years of this assembly. What we do is parliamentary diplomacy, and each of us have their role. I'm just a rapporteur, but everybody has a big role in this point. Second, Harriet, on strategic positions of Russia, absolutely. That's why Tartus is in the report. I made that point as well. I think that whole the concept of the ice-free sea doctrine of Moscow, it is very important. So we will make some points about Sudan and the Red Sea. I think that we can do that as well, and we will emphasize that more in the conclusions. I think that we need to make that point. Then Mehmet, thank you very much. As I said, I think we can never underestimate the efforts that Turkey, as an ally from so many years of our beautiful NATO alliance, is doing in the most difficult region of the world, as a pivotal region between Europe and Middle East and Asia. That is Turkey, that is your country. We can never underestimate, and I think that in the report we really emphasize this, not one time, not two times, I think 4 or 5 times, that you're doing a great job. And I think it's important to make a report about Middle East, that we need to focalize also on the efforts that were done and are done every single day by Turkey. Then on your amendments on Syrian defense or democratic forces, that you say it's shelter for PKK, YPG. We cannot mention that in the report. That's a point taken, so we will take that amendment by heart. And then the second point on Hamas, I did not put my personal emotions in the report, Mehmet. I think we try to balance. I saw your amendments, and I see that you're not agreeing on the balance is not the right balance for you, but it is not that. That is my personal opinion that is in the report. That's why we have Matthew and Paul to know. So I think that we can talk about this. This is a draft report. We will present the report so we have the summer to talk and to try to maybe we can formulate some things a bit more in a balanced way, if you want. That is always possible. There's no problem for me to talk about it and to find a compromise. So we saw your amendments and we will talk. I will contact you in a couple of weeks and we will try to fix a good compromise on that point, because it is very sensitive, absolutely. Your mic, you have to put your mic.
My point is, I didn't want to go in details. If you define the attack came from Gaza, which is unacceptable, we also criticize and we call on the authorities in Gaza to release the Israeli hostages unconditionally. If this is defined as terrorism, then what Israel is doing now is also a state of terrorism, state terrorism, because they are also killing the innocent infants, children, women, and elderly people in the camp. They are forcibly
Can I
displaced.
answer? Can I answer those accusations? Thank you very much.
Therefore, there should be a balance over there. This is what I meant.
Yes, but I don't think we need to go. Because it's a report of NATO PA. So we're presenting this report. I know that there were amendments by the Turkey's delegation from Turkey, and we will talk about this. Of course, yeah, but of course, you have another position on that. You're not the only one. Yeah.
Because you know, hypocrisy has a meaning, and that's what we hear right now. But I'll speak. I heard my friends from Turkey. I don't see which delegation spoke over there about Algeria. Good. So first of all, I think that Turkey is hosting Hamas members coming to Turkey, meaning the new Nazis are being hosted over there. And it's funny to come to a platform like this, international platform, and speak as if looking for trying to be balanced. I think it's shocking because you know perfectly well exactly who attacked, who's the aggressor, and who's defending himself. And you know perfectly well, you speak about NATO. I was, before being a member of parliament, I was a journalist myself. I covered war in Kosovo, Iraq #1, Iraq #2, Afghanistan, and I know how much countries take the liberty of defending themselves. Second point to my Algerian friends. You know, you speak about genocide. Please, you speak about genocide in Gaza. My God, you come from Algeria and you say such a thing. Let me remind you a little bit of your history, sir. September 1991.
Excuse me.
By the way, civil war in Algeria till 2002. 100,000 people died inside Algeria, and you give Israel lessons. So I think it's shocking. A country that fought terrorism, 100,000 people died. Military took the liberty of killing people over there in this war. I'm not saying it. Europe said it. You sent the delegation in 1998, and you said it yourself. And Algeria comes here to give lessons to Israel. My God, what a disgrace.
Thank you. Thank you. All right. No, let's say we're finishing. We're closing this. This continues with the answers. Theo is answering you with your point for the report, which is the topic of discussion, the report. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Of course, it's a sensitive point, and we will work on that point, and we will find a solution. Don't worry. It is not the main issue of the report. We're not writing a report on the conflict between Israel and Hamas. That's not even on the table. So Mohammed, thank you very much for the intervention. I think that your emphasis on national sovereignty, I think we can maybe elaborate that more in the report. The young generation that in North African countries and in the MENA region is really focalizing and is really giving a lot of attention, and I think it's a good thing on national sovereignty, and that we need to have a lot of respect for that. Then on your point from Islamophobia and extreme right, the extreme right is raising in Western and European countries. I don't think it's so simple. I know that it can be very shocking to read some things about that in your countries. That's true, and of course you have in a lot of countries like my country, there's a big Algerian community, there's a big Moroccan community, a big Tunisian community. But I don't think that, I don't think that Islamophobia or not talking about that religion will solve anything. I think that the problems are, underlying problems are big, way bigger than that. And so I hope that when rights politicians or politicians in Europe taking stance, or governments taking stance, that it's not always translated as Islamophobic. Because that's the overreaction we see always, or we see a lot of times, is not a win either. Let me say it like that. I think that's it's a difficult debate, of course. I was in Morocco, and I had an incident. It's 10 years ago when I was a minister of migration, because the opposition was claiming that I was a racist. And I was there in Morocco, and your prime minister was asking me, "Are you a racist minister? Is there a racist minister coming to my country? You, Mr. Franken, are you a racist?" It was super annoying for me, because I'm not a racist. It's absurd. But there was like a whole debate in Belgian Parliament, and the left opposition, they were saying, "He's racist, he's racist, he's racist." So the Moroccan ambassador told the prime minister of Morocco, "He's not a racist, he's not a racist. I know him, he's a good friend, he's a good friend of Morocco, he's not a racist." And then they stopped, then the debate stopped. But my coming to to Morocco, but also Algeria, is just the same. It gave a lot of tensions in your press that I was coming to your country. A racist is coming. And he's Minister of Migration, and he wants to get them all out. So I know how it works. That is not the solution. That's really not the solution. It's not because you have a clear point of view on how to tackle migration better in the future, because it's not working. The solutions now we have with the European Union, they're not working, sorry. We need to have other solutions, but then with trying to fix things like the border problems, then immediately having the mark that you're a racist or Islamophobic, it's just absurd. So we don't win neither on that way, nor on the other way. So, and then on the fairness and the double standards, I know what you mean. We just had some issues about that. I know what you mean, and we will talk about that with the report and try to try to get out. Then Paolo, finally. Thank you very much. I'm totally agreeing on the fact that on migration we need to also engage more with countries of origin, but also countries of transit, like the North African countries. Your Prime Minister is doing a lot of efforts with Madame von der Leyen, European Commissioner, trying to make deals with African countries of transit and origin. We need to do that more, I think. We made a deal, EU-Turkey deal. We made in 2016 to fix the problem at that moment. Mehmet was a Minister of Foreign Affairs at that moment, and it's a deal that worked. And there's Syrian refugees. There were millions of Syrian refugees in Turkey, but it's a deal that worked. So we need to copy that model and do even more of that politics, I think. So thank you very much.
Thank you. All right, dear colleagues, 5 minutes late, so no problem. This concludes our last point of the day in the seminar. Big thank you to Theo for the report and for the answers provided to all that has made questions and remarks. I also wish to thank our experts for their insightful interventions throughout the day, as well as all of you for your participation. Lastly, thank you to our wonderful interpreters for the task they have accomplished and their hard work along the day. For those who are invited, to the reception tonight, the invitees are requested to be in front of the Albergo Nazionale, Hotel Nazionale, close to here, and staff will guide them to Terrazza Borromini, or they can go on their own. It must be no far away from the hotel. The people living from the hotel will depart no later than 19:30, and the dinner will be at 20:30. There will be a cocktail before the dinner. Wear your badge, please, to access the reception and dinner. Lastly, the last message for today, before the dinner, or before going to the hotel. For tomorrow, and those members of NATO parliaments traveling to Naples, the bus will be at Plaza Montecitorio from 1300 hours. Members can bring their luggage in the bus starting at that time, because before the bus will not be there. At 1300 hours to 1 o'clock after midday. It will depart at 14:30, more or less sharp. However, sharp, the paper says sharp, 14:30 to 2:30. However, please note that no luggage will be allowed into the parliament facilities. Thank you very much and enjoy the evening.